You're listening to an audio resource from Redemption Hill Church. This resource is not meant to be a replacement for participation at a local church, but an accessory to the care you're receiving from your own pastors. To learn more about Redemption Hill Church or to give to our ministry, visit redemptionhilldsm.org.
Rousseau, Hobbes, Freud, Marx, Calvin and Hobbes. We're here to tell you how all these individuals lead us to talking about a super king on this edition of Cornfield Theology. All right, everyone, welcome back to another edition of Cornfield Theology. This particular edition is coming live from, a guest house in Kansas City. No, sorry, we're in Kansas.
And we're in Overland Park.
Overland Park. So I just offended a ton of people in Kansas City or Overland Park, depending how you look at it. Well, that voice that you hear or that you're seeing on YouTube there is Chris Oswald. Chris, how you doing?
Doing well, man. How are you?
Good. We have been friends. How long have we been friends? I was thinking about this.
I was too. I mean, I know for sure 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah. I think it's longer than that. I think it's like 12. I think 2008 is what sticks out of my head.
Yeah. The first conversation I remember having with you, I was really offended, by the way.
That's very common for people's first conversation with me.
Was about like postmillennialism.
I remember, yeah.
You messed up all my millennial sensibilities.
I remember we were bowling. Weren't we bowling?
Yeah, we were bowling at that time.
Yeah.
That was one of the first conversations. And it's like you went all in on post-mill, and I'm like,
you were making fun of me. I don't know why you were the one that was offended.
Well, as I said earlier, we were at lunch. Like I, depending on how the wind's blowing, I either fall into the mill camp or the post-mill camp.
Right.
So, which is pretty typical and non-committal.
Yeah.
Well, we're here to talk about we're doing a few podcasts together, which is really cool, really exciting, really grateful that we get to do this because one, we just love jabbering in general about theology, politics, philosophy, all those aforementioned figures that we just mentioned at the introduction there, Hobbes, Freud, Rousseau,
bad guy,
and Calvin and Hobbes, which, I think that like half of our listeners are like more familiar with Calvin and Hobbes than they are Thomas Hobbes.
Yes.
So we're going to get into that a little bit. And really what we're talking about is in part a sermon that you preached regarding this idea of a super king, right? And right. That's where we're headed. What do you, like when you put those together, you're like, we're going to talk about a super king. I'm like, what are you talking about? Have you drunk too much bourbon? No, I'm just kidding.
Probably.
Like, where are we headed with this? And after I listened to your sermon, I'm like, this is good because you worked within a particular worldview, right? And we mentioned Rousseau and Freud
right.
and Marx and Thomas Hobbes and his political ideas and how they really lead us to this idea of a super king. Explain a little bit about first what a super king is.
Well, so this all started for me. I was going through Acts 9 with my church, and there's a moment where it says that Paul, early in his conversion, grew in strength, and then it gave the definition of what does it mean to grow in strength, and it's to prove that Jesus was the Christ.
Yeah.
And so that was cool. I thought, okay, so it's also cool, just to take a quick detour, is just that Paul is a guy who's probably known for being pronouncedly weak. You know, a lot of our understanding of Paul is rooted in his thorn in the flesh or in his approach to the Corinthian church. Packer wrote that book a couple of years ago called Weakness is the Way, that dealt with, I think, 2 Corinthians. Anyway, so I thought that was really compelling, and it was the idea that, well, what it means for me or for any other Christian to grow into strength is to be able to prove to the world that Jesus is the Christ.
Yeah.
So then I started unpacking, okay, well, what does that even mean to prove that Jesus is the Christ? And there are different kinds of proofs that one can offer. So
you get into apologetics and things like that.
And so Paul was, a forefront, like a pioneer on these sorts of things. And he was interacting with both a Jewish and Gentile world. And so he was actually kind of operating within some frameworks of what we would call classic Greek philosophy and so on. And
Platonism in particular.
Yeah. And so he was, so I kind of began to ask, well, what were some of the ways that Paul proved that Jesus is the Christ? And one of the ways is not philosophical, it's through his own suffering.
Yeah.
So I preached the message on that.
Yeah.
And another way that's not philosophical is just the historicity of the resurrection.
Yeah.
Preach the message on that.
You go to 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah. And so then I thought, well, but Paul did have a philosophical flair, and it's evident in all of his works. And so I began to ask, well, what are some ways that we can use the science of philosophy to prove that Jesus is the Christ?
Yeah.
And so that led me to another question, and that was, well, what is the Christ? What does the Christ mean? What would it have meant to contemporary audiences and so forth? And I really walked away thinking that the Christ is, for our terms, or for the way I would describe it to some 20-year-old in my church, the Christ is a super king.
Yeah.
The king over all the kings.
Would the 40-year-old understand? Because I'm 39. He said super king. The 20-year-old gets it, but
yeah, I wanted that phrase to be non-conventional, because we hear the word Christ or Messiah and we think we know what that means. Yeah. But really, we've got to remember that in antiquity, in the ancient days, there were these guys that would just sort of consume the whole world at a given particular moment, like Alexander the Great.
Yeah, it's the biggest one,
the Babylonian Empire and so forth.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh.
Yeah. So there were these figures that were global. Now they may have, as maybe we'll get to this down the road, they may have left a regional king in charge.
Right, Herod would have been a regional.
Precisely. So Caesar is the New Testament super king.
Yeah, exactly.
And the competition.
So it would have been Nero or Claudius, and but in Palestine they got like a provincial or regional type figures. Yeah.
And so what I concluded is studying, like, what does the Christ mean? That's what it means. The Christ means a figure who is over all, the sovereign over all the sovereigns. And so we're not that far past Christmas time, but I'm thinking of Handel's Messiah and King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The government will be upon his shoulders and so forth. And so I think that when Paul is arguing that Jesus is the Christ, he is making a political argument, and it's a political argument that is more nuanced and complicated than what we think of as politics, but it was a political argument.
So let me ask you this question, because I was listening to your message and kind of reading through some of your notes. How much does your personal eschatology impact what you're talking about here? Because you say you're making this, this overtly political argument, right? Does eschatology play a factor into how you've processed this?
I would imagine,
as a postmillennial.
I would imagine that. I think one way I'd like to respond to that is that eschatology, whether you have one or not, is always affecting the way you view Jesus. Yeah. So even if you don't think you have an eschatology,
so pan-millennialism, it's all going to pan out.
That's affecting your view of Jesus, and it's affecting your definition of who Jesus is. Like, one way I talk about this is that when Jesus is speaking to Pilate, and Pilate asks, are you the king of the Jews? Yeah. Jesus responds by saying, my kingdom is not of this world. And that's a question of origin. What Jesus did not say is, my kingdom is not for this world.
Right.
So I think the answer to your question is
or
yes.
in this world.
Right. Yeah. So I think the answer to your question is yes, my eschatology is informing this, although I would say that for me personally, my journey to postmillennialism was explicitly through the Old Testament, Daniel, Isaiah, and so forth. I think postmillennialism, if we're going to talk about it real quickly, is unique among the eschatologies in that it leans least on the book of Revelation out of all the other eschatological positions. Yeah. I think that's an asset, because I think Revelation is one of the more difficult books to sort out meaning. So I think if my eschatology depends a lot on a book like Revelation, I might think that's less secure than an eschatology that leans more heavily on passages of scripture that are more easy to exegete and understand.
Yeah. So for this particular topic, I think you worked out of Daniel 7.
Correct? And I really read that Daniel 7 passage in the Message just because I think this is the working definition of what Jesus the Christ means. Yeah. And I'll just read that. It says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And so we read that passage. It gives me goosebumps to read that passage. We read that passage and we think of extent, perhaps, or duration. It will not pass away. That tends to be the primary focus of all eschatological positions. This kingdom is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. It's a kingdom forever.
Right.
But this passage also speaks to the extent, not just duration, but extent of the kingdom. And it says that all peoples, right? All nations, all languages. And so this is that super king. To say that Jesus and Caesar were in direct competition with each other is exactly true, in my opinion. Yeah. They both had the same vision, and that was to rule all things.
Well, even Herod, on a more local level, was in direct competition.
And he knew that
at the incarnation. Yeah, absolutely. So there was in the political milieu of that time competition going on. He's a king? Are you kidding me? Let's kill all the boys.
Yeah, yeah. So Christians are afraid, I think, to bring Christ into politics, but Christ is politics. His vision is to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through the blood of the cross and turning all rulers and authorities into his footstools. Right.
So this is going to go outside the scope a little bit of kind of the notes that we were kind of working through together. So how do Christians do politics wrong? Because I hear that and I say, yes, I agree. But, you go on social media for, a cup of coffee and you realize politics is clearly not thought of well by a lot of Christians.
So Christians do politics wrong the same way they do theology wrong, in the same way they do church wrong, in the same way they do marriage wrong. And that is they isolate attributes of God or gifts of God or truths of God, and they isolate those and worship those as ultimate rather than keep constantly pointing back to the Lord. So, for instance, I have certain values that I derive from my belief that Jesus is God and that Jesus and his teachings are the way. But I'm not pushing values, I'm pushing Christ.
Correct.
So anything that you do that winds up, so for instance, people can latch on to the idea of like, well, I want to be loving because Jesus was loving. No, I want to be like Christ. It's not actually that small of a distinction, those two things. So Christians do politics wrong the same way they do theology wrong. Theology it's so easy, as you know, you're an astute theologian. Like it's so easy to start isolating attributes away from God.
Right. In our Reform camps, God is sovereign.
That's
especially during that's the attribute we highlight over all the other attributes. And to a hearty amen, I would say, yes, God is sovereign. Yeah. As a Reformed dude, I totally hold that. Yet there is more to God than he is sovereign. That is a true statement. There are other true statements that we need to fill in to help us understand who God is and what he's doing, in particular in this kind of political environment.
Yeah. So for me, what I regret, what I wish I didn't see so often is someone who has got Christ 7 steps down from their argument. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, I'll get to Jesus eventually. Like, no, the argument for all politics is God came to earth and preached a kingdom of which he was the king, and that kingdom is going to consume all other kingdoms. So let's bend our knee now.
It's not just Christian-centered politics. It's even more. It's Christ-centered.
Exactly.
Politics.
That's the perfect way to say it. It's not Christian politics. It's Christ-centered politics. It's not a Christian marriage. It's a Christ-centered marriage. It's not a Christian church. It's a Christ-centered church.
Fact check true. Absolutely.
Yeah. Everything about that distinction, you could spend tons of time thinking about how you and I, on a regular basis, defy that particular distinction, go astray from that particular distinction. So that's how Christians do politics wrong. They think that the more explicit they get about Christ, the more fringe, the more extreme, and so forth. It's just the opposite. Yes. Because when you abandon Christ from your political arguments, which are then just simply Christian, you abandon all of the virtue of Jesus, all of the strength and love of Jesus, the patience and clarity of Jesus. Like, you want Jesus in your politics. You don't want Jesus ideas in your politics.
Yeah. So another way to think about it, especially as we talk about a teleological argument for a super king, before you get to the attributes or the virtues, you work through Christ, not the other way around.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this teleological argument, explain this idea of teleology.
Yeah. So going back, so I'm asking myself, okay, so how does philosophy attempt to prove what are some useful philosophical tools that one could prove the existence of Christ? So Paul uses arguments related to nature. For instance, in Acts 14 or Acts 17, he'll say, "God who gave you rain, the God who gave you rain sent Jesus," and so on and so forth. So there are different ways to get into that. John, the opening chapter of John, in the beginning was the Logos, and there's a philosophical rootedness to that,
which is very connected to Platonism, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, very connected.
And there's a book out right now. It's called Logos Rising, and I can't remember the author, but it sounds like just an exceptional book. But I don't think it's even out yet, but it's coming out. So I think I've got that somewhere in my notes. Maybe I'll find it. Anyway, so one of the ways that we come to reason or conclusions in life is through the process of teleology. And teleology is the examination of a thing and then sort of working out the existence of deeper meaning out of that particular thing. When it comes to apologetics, I think probably the most common teleological argument related to politics or related to Christianity is like the complexity of the universe, the Goldilocks effect. And so that's the argument that, look at how fine-tuned the universe is, so on and so forth. There must be a fine-tuner. There must be a programmer. Or there's like the
which by the way, from an apologetic perspective, evidential, I think that's a good argument.
Yeah,
it's fine. It's not the end all of the conversation, but it's a piece of the overall apologetic puzzle.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I think it's a good argument. I think it depends on some sort of agreement that we know a great deal about the universe, and I'm not sure we do. So my concern with the Goldilocks phenomenon argument is like we only know what we can see within this. So there could be other Earths conceivably. There could be other fine-tuned universes and so on and so forth.
Sounds like conspiracy theory level here.
No. But the bigger problem I have with it, and also the biological complexity argument. So teleological argument for biological complexity is just like, look at how complex.
Irreducible complexity.
Yes.
Intelligent design.
Yeah.
I think the particular scientist or biologist, Beakey, was the one who came up with.
I think that's right.
Yeah, irreducible complexity.
I like that one too. But again, what you get with both of those is you get something less than Jesus.
Yeah.
You get ancient aliens, or you get the simulation hypothesis, or you just get like deism. So I was shooting for something, again, back to that Acts 9, I was shooting for something that proved Jesus was the Christ from a teleological perspective.
Yeah, not just that a God exists, but being very specific about who God is.
And I wanted to use a data set that was pretty observable, that people could say, yeah, I think he's right about his observations. And I think I found that in political science and Hobbes. But I wanted it to land on Jesus. I wanted it not just to land on a God or something like that.
And I think it's fair to say at this point, you have some presuppositions in coming to this argument, right? This teleological argument for a super king. In other words, right, we all have presuppositions we bring to the table in trying to work through it. And I think being aware of that it helps you process.
Yeah. And I mean, there are so many presuppositions that we couldn't sort them all out, but like one of the presuppositions I'm carrying is the historicity of Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think is pretty valid presupposition.
Strong, absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, we've moved to the point now where that's just kind of like even
there's a consensus.
Bart Ehrman believes in the historicity of Jesus. So that's one of the presuppositions.
When Muslims believe in Jesus, along with
Yeah.
the Christians, you have a lot of people who believe, at least on a human level, a man named Jesus walked the earth in the first century.
And I think that, like, even so Ehrman again is a guy that I look to who's not a believer and a critic,
but a former evangelical, right? So he has his categories.
Yeah, and I find his objections useful, and I find not just his objections useful, but also kind of what he consents to be useful. So looking at like a guy like that, who's a credible New Testament scholar, probably one of the top 10 New Testament scholars. If you can be a top 10 New Testament scholar and not be a Christian, but anyway,
it's another discussion for another day.
But I look at like his consensus that Jesus was a real person, that most of the teachings we have were probably his teachings, and so on and so forth. So those are presuppositions I'm bringing to this. But other than that, I don't think I have a lot of presuppositions that aren't readily observable. For instance, everything I'm going to say about politics, I believe that I would say, probably 90% of people would be in majority agreement with the statements I'll make about the state of politics and so forth. The other thing I really liked about...
You mean it's a dumpster fire?
Yeah. And it has been for a long time.
The other thing I really liked about this approach, I kind of gave myself a job that was pretty hard to do, but I set the parameters tight enough where I'm like, I want something that is evidential to most people, and I want it to land on Christ. And the thing I actually kind of like how this worked out, and again, I think this is just God, but I think that what I really liked about how this worked out was that I feel like political science is one of those sciences that is, in fact, data-driven. There's plenty of science behind it and so forth. But it's one of those that people do have an intuitive sense. Like we were talking at lunch about one of the things we've learned over this year is that what you see with your eyes may be more predictable or more reliable. And so I feel like people believe your eyes before you believe someone else telling you.
I feel
social
like
media.
Political science is actually a very approachable science. I think there's a fair amount of intuition involved. The other thing I like about it is that I think all of the best philosophy that's been produced and since Plato has been about politics. I think a lot of the worst philosophy out there is about color theory or consciousness or how do I know anything and so on. But some of the best philosophy that's come into being over the last several thousand years is related to politics.
And I would say the most debated philosophies are about political theory, right? So I think about Marxism in general. Think about 2020, how all of a sudden that became one of the talking points from, in particular for conservatives who were talking about movements across the country. Neo-Marxism, as it were.
And so I didn't know a lot about Hobbes when I set out to do this thing. I just kind of gave myself a job and thought, okay, can I make this work?
Well, I kind of pause it. When I listened to your sermon, I'm like, he is talking about Thomas Hobbes from the pulpit. And how did you folks receive that? Your Providence Community Church here in Lenexa, Kansas. How they receive that?
I mean, I didn't hear anything negative.
It's usually a good sign, right?
Yeah, maybe. Got a lot of good positive feedback.
That's good. Because that's not something a pastor would normally do. That's why I kind of highlight it.
I did explicitly state. So we have a lot of younger guys in our church, all younger guys and gals in our church. And one of the most encouraging things I've found about those guys is that because they all went to like state schools and they got their architecture degree or whatever, these guys know more about apologetics than I would have ever guessed, because they've had to walk through all of these things. So these guys already have some sense about the historicity of the resurrection, for instance, or the reliability of New Testament manuscripts and the diversity of those manuscripts. And like, I've been impressed to talk to these guys and realize how, just by necessity of being a Christian in a secular university and so forth, these guys are kind of a little bit above what you would expect in terms of the apologetic sense. But I did say explicitly when we went into this series, we called it Proving Christ. I did say explicitly, now there are going to be a couple weeks where like I'm barely going to use a text, and I'm going to use more classically apologetic tools. Approach, and I think you probably will wind up doing that at some point, in the future as well. And it's sort of like, you just have to let them know this isn't what normal preaching is.
Expositional.
This is different than that. But people seem to receive it well. There's a photo that was on the cover of Hobbes's work, Leviathan, and I recommend looking it up. It's a lithograph. You should just Google lithograph Hobbes Leviathan, and it's just the most compelling picture. And I put that picture up on the screen while I was talking about a lot of this, and it actually really seemed to help people process what we were talking about. The photo is essentially got a king who is looming over a village. He looks like Gulliver over a small village, and he's holding up a sword in one hand and a light in the other hand, and that represents the church and the state. But his body is composed of all people. His body is composed of masses of people, and that's Hobbes's vision of the Leviathan, which we'll talk about in a minute.
So you make two basic arguments for a teleological argument for a super king. What are those two basic arguments?
Well, I think the idea is that when we look at the history of the world, and this is going to be supported by our discussion of Hobbes, you'll see this kind of consistent need for a ruler.
Which we talked about. We mentioned like Alexander the Great, Pharaoh, Caesar.
And even if it's just like, what's the mayor on, or what's the policeman on oh gosh, I'm having a blank. But on The Simpsons, the what's his name? Anyway, the guy with the Boston accent. Like, even if it's just the dumb sheriff, even if it's Andy from Mayberry or something,
your local mayor.
We are built to have some sort of ruling structure. And then the second point is that when you look at the history of those rulers, they're just all weighed and found wanting. They're just not good enough.
Yeah.
So
we even when we elect people and our guy or gal gets elected, we have that need, but we also see the flaws too, the foibles that may exist in an individual.
So what was the first presidential election you voted in?
I voted in 2000. What was it?
So that was Bush.
That was Bush, yeah.
It was Bush Gore.
Bush Gore.
Yeah. Yep. So that was your it was suspenseful. Your first one was a little suspenseful.
Yep.
Not as suspenseful as this one.
No.
Yeah. So I think I voted the one before that. I think I'm just a little bit older than you. And I've never voted for a candidate that I thought that I was super excited about voting for.
But we realize there's authority structures or figures, whatever. And even in, it's interesting, even some political theories where they want to tear down the authority structures, there's always an authority structure. So, you know what I'm saying? So they think about a person like Marx, for example, he wants to tear it all down and give it to the people, but we don't realize you still have a ruler. You still have your own version of like a king.
Yeah. So the basic arguments I wound up observing, Hobbes was a great help in this respect, was we were created to have some sort of, we need some kind of ruler over us, but every ruler that we've ever had over us was significantly wanting. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are just okay.
Any good ones come to mind?
Even someone, I think George Washington's probably as best as I understand the best leader that
and the person you can mention where you won't get a ton of flack.
Well, he did own slaves, but I remember King George said that if Washington took power and gave it up, it would be the most revolutionary act in like the history of the world or something.
Yeah, in the first election where there was a peaceful transfer of power was, I think, from Adams to Jefferson or Jefferson to Adams? I'm not sure one or two.
Yeah.
Where that was revolutionary, no pun intended, in terms of politics in the world, where it peacefully took place. Yeah. There wasn't a riot afterwards.
Yeah, so I think that Washington comes to mind, but then even with Washington, the slavery thing's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think when someone like me says these guys are guys worthy of respect and so forth, in spite of the slavery piece, it can sound like what I'm saying is that slavery is not a big deal. No, it's an abomination.
Absolutely.
It's terrible, and yet we have to look through the history books and see that none of our leaders were really free of sizable problems.
That makes the point that you were making earlier,
right,
which is like we can have good leaders who are deeply flawed,
and honestly, that they're not good enough.
Exactly.
That's the basic argument. Those deep flaws matter. So even Lincoln, there's just a ton of debate to be had about Lincoln, about his faith, about his extra constitutional. Basically, there's an argument to be made that Lincoln shredded the Constitution to save the Constitution.
Right.
Which sort of doesn't work that way.
Right.
So you look at these men and you say, even if they were good people, which many of them were not, but you say, even if they were good people, their weaknesses and flaws led to ongoing difficulties.
Oh, Churchill! I've been reading a lot about World War II recently.
Yeah,
and it's like, was he a courageous leader? I think you had to be to go through World War II
right,
or come out on the other side as the victor.
Right.
Was he deeply flawed and disliked by a lot of people on his own side?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I found out that during Prohibition in America, he had to take a doctor's note with him because he was so much of an alcoholic.
Yes.
He had to have like the doctor's note said, like he had to have like half a bottle of whiskey with breakfast and so on and so forth.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Grant's another example.
Yep.
General Grant from the Civil War. I mean, the guy could have put the bottle down. His closest friend, I'm not sure what his particular title, was always with him to ensure he didn't have the bottle in his hand. And so, again, a person where you go to Washington, D.C., you see the statue, you see Grant, and it's just like amazing statue. And you look at him as a great king, as it were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hero, but deeply flawed. So, again, wanting. There's a lacking. And so,
by the way, just quickly with Lincoln, one of Lincoln's greatest flaws was that he got shot.
Yeah.
Like, so sometimes it's not even a moral flaw. Sometimes it's just a flaw rooted in basic physics and humanity.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, our entire experience of racial inequity and so forth that we've walked through since Lincoln really, I think, was directly tied into Lincoln's assassination.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say John Wilkes Booth is the most influential person in the past 150 years.
Wow.
He set a stage for the reparations that should have occurred in the South. There should have been immediate reparations, giving of land, the 40 acres and a mule, and all that sort of stuff. And I think Lincoln was heading in that direction, and if he had not been assassinated, and he's dead, and Johnson takes over.
Reconstruction,
and So sometimes the flaws aren't even moral. Sometimes the flaws are just like, dude, I wish you didn't die.
Yeah,
I think Lincoln's best term was going to be his next term.
Yeah, I'd agree. So continuing on with this, talk more about Hobbes and his influence.
Okay, so then you're beginning to kind of think, well, I need handles for just what politics is.
Yeah.
And there's some people that, like Rousseau or Nietzsche or Marx, who are just not technicians in the way that we need them to be. They're polemicists. They're I saw this meme of Nietzsche, it was Nietzsche, and then next to Nietzsche was like a 20-something grad student, and the 20-something grad student said, I spent 7 years writing this doctoral thesis, and it has 15 pages of footnotes, and I hope you like it. And then it shows Nietzsche, and he says, I just took a bath and figured out what the world needs, submit to my plan. So some of these guys were polemicists more than they were actual philosophers. Right. So I think Marx gets called a philosopher. I don't think he really was. Nietzsche, I think, was one of those guys who he was like a performance artist. I actually value some of what Nietzsche had to say, but he was like a performance artist. He wasn't a philosopher. You start going down the list, you see a lot of these guys aren't real thinkers. Hobbes was a real thinker, and what he reports is most compatible with a Christian perspective on humanity. So I was into Hobbes right away. When I started reading Leviathan, I was like, oh, okay, I think I'm onto something.
So Hobbes, we're talking 17th century Englishman.
Yep, 1651 is when Leviathan was published.
Okay.
It was during the English Civil War with the Puritans, Cromwell, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so what Hobbes did, and this is what all good philosophers do, is they try to get all the way back to the beginning of something, and all past every sort of reduce something as far down. And so Hobbes decided, what is the state of mankind at its most irreducible state? And he called that the state of nature. And the state of nature for him is man living in a perfect freedom, absent of any laws.
Yep.
So no rules at all, just man doing whatever he wants to do. And he decided that in that perfect state of nature where there are no rules, then essentially power reigns.
Right.
And he called it the war of all against all.
So who's the strongest, basically?
Yeah. And I've traveled overseas and been to countries where that's the rule.
Yeah.
Who's the strongest? I've been to small towns in the South where that's the rule.
Yeah.
So who's the strongest is what Hobbes says is the basic state of nature.
Right.
If everybody can do whatever they want, and you have something I want, or I have something you want, then
just take it.
Who's the strongest,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Who's the craftiest? Can I raise up a group of guys to come over and take your chickens?
Right.
I've really been.
And to some degree, who's the least in our terms, least moral, right?
Right.
Who doesn't value the life of another person or their goods or whatever. And so whoever can be reduced to that lowest level, oftentimes can be the strongest one in the room in the sense of getting what they want, however they want to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's the kind of the state of nature. Anything else on that particular issue? Because there's another principle you want to.
Well, I wanted to find a quote where Hobbes actually talks about this. Hobbes essentially says that life in that state would be just absolutely miserable. I think, here we go. In such condition, There is no place for industry, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he's describing a world without laws in which we are free to do whatever we want. And he says it would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
So a war of all against all.
A war of all against all.
Gotcha.
Yep. So that sounds a lot like total depravity.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like the book of Judges.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like Genesis 6. Just this idea of unchecked evil of the power. And this also, we've mentioned racial equality, and so this also speaks to just power politics and power dynamics. Women are not treated well in this world, in this violent state of nature.
Right.
Children are not treated well in this violent state of nature. It really does just come down to who's the strongest. And the problem is that even if you're strongest today,
might not be tomorrow.
Or I could just get a bunch of less strong guys to gang up, and we could split your,
Right.
we could steal your truck from you.
No, don't touch my truck.
So the first rule for Hobbes is that state of nature, and I think personally, that that's unequivocally true. Now, Rousseau is exactly on the other opposite side of the spectrum here. He thinks that, and if we had no overlords and so on and so forth, we would just be, everything would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, side note, maybe a footnote, I think part of what we see today is this combination of Marx and Rousseau.
Yes.
Oscar Wilde in his writings, his poetry, kind of bringing that to life. That's kind of what we see today.
I agree.
Like, it's more anti-authoritarian, break down the structure, break down all authority structures, which again, ironically, go back to, you do that, you still end up with strong men.
Right. I'm a big music fan of the 60s and 70s, and I can't remember what year it was. I think it was 1967. The Beatles produced a song called She's Leaving Home. And it's a sad song about a little teenage girl who's, full of herself, and she decides to leave home, and she leaves her parents a note. Well, they wrote that in the year that they were responding to something that was happening in pop culture amongst the hippies. And what was happening was teenage girls in particular, I think in that year, 1967, if I'm not mistaken, over 500,000 teenage girls ran away from home in the United States. And they all had the same idea. They all had a Rousseauian sort of idea, right? That my parents' rules are oppressive.
Right.
My parents only care about money and power and so forth. And so they all migrated west, out to these communes in the West. And what happened inevitably with these teenage girls is they would wind up becoming property of some strongman guru who basically turned them into sex slaves. Yeah. And so that's a very cogent or important point to be had, is that you're going to have a strong man, and we're going to get to this in a moment. You got to pick the right one. Like her dad, who loved money but didn't was like protecting her. He was a better strongman. Yeah.
Well, a more modern contemporary example is the whole Chaz Chop thing in Seattle.
Yeah.
They created this autonomous zone. It's like, we're all equal here and everyone's free. And then what do we end up seeing? Individuals rise to the top. They have their own security detail because, it wasn't formal, but someone's like, I'm in charge. And because he was the strong man.
He was the strongest one.
He was the strongest one. And so at the end of the day, it just goes back to what you said earlier, depravity.
Yeah.
And that's really important to start from a place of depravity, theologically speaking, because if you start from a place where, there is no depravity, then what becomes the point of oppression? It's not your own sin. It becomes the structure outside of you that is bringing the oppression upon you.
Yep.
And so that
well
Hobbes,
said.
Yeah. And I think Hobbes, he absolutely was thinking through the right spectrum in terms of talking about depravity as the point of issue, I guess.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call Hobbes a Puritan by any means, but he definitely had influence from Reformed thinking. And so, he definitely diverges in many areas related to morality. But this idea that if left to ourselves, we would be at war, I think is sound.
Absolutely.
So I think another way to test that would be dump 4 boxes of Fruit Loops in the middle of a daycare, have all the adults leave and lock the doors. Like just watch, watch these 2-year-olds fight over Fruit Loops. They'll be like little warlords formed. And,
I got all the blue Fruit Loops over here.
Yeah. We're the blue tribe over here. Make your necklaces now. Lord of the Flies is like the classic Hobbesian sort of outworking. It's like, this is what life would look like if there were no rules.
Left to ourselves, everything's a dumpster fire. Everything's a hot mess.
Yep.
So what is the way forward?
Well, so Hobbes observed, now this is something that I personally would agree with, some total depravitizers would disagree with, but Hobbes observed that, we're these brutish warlord types, but there's a rationality at work in us that understands that some cooperation is necessary in order for us to not just all kill each other. So this begins the thought process, and we've seen this with COVID this year, of mankind is actually willing to give up some of their freedoms for some measure of comfort, safety, predictability, and so forth.
Yeah.
So Hobbes called this contractarianism. Essentially, people would just agree to not kill each other, and then they would share whatever they could. And so
covenants too. You could use that word.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's a covenant. And so you say you and I are, living in this brutish, nasty, and short world, and we both decide, like, I kind of don't want to die, and you're like, yeah, I don't want to die either. And I was like, what if we agreed to not kill each other and to protect each other, and then we shared our stuff, and like we lived in vans, for instance. Marauding through the highway, and so like, what if we made that agreement and our families, like, we weren't going to be mean to each other? Well, that's what Hobbes would call contractarianism, and so his argument is that that's good. I don't know if Hobbes even believed in good exactly, but that's where we wind up. But Hobbes would say, who's enforcing the contract?
Right.
So what's to stop me any day at any moment
breaking it,
from killing you behind your back?
These are conditional contracts.
Yes. So Hobbes deduced from that you've got to have a sword. You've got to have someone enforcing the contract. So Hobbes, remember, now he's working back, and I think we get impatient with people who go all the way back to the beginning of things that we already think are true. But like, this is what philosophers do. This is their discipline. So he's got us all the way back to the state of nature. He thinks we're terrible to each other, but we have some rationality and are willing to cooperate. So we'd start these contracts or covenants. But then what's to keep us from breaking these? Someone has to mediate those covenants. Someone has to oversee them.
Yep.
And that's why he calls his book Leviathan. Leviathan is this image of a ruler who is made up of people. He's the people's ruler, but he is enforcing the contracts. He's enforcing the covenants with the sword.
Hence, we have our king, whether it be the individual or, would you say, a government structure could be the king as well?
Yep. Yeah.
Elected
now,
official.
There's always a point of violence. I think we'll talk about this in the next podcast, but there's always a point of violence in all government action. So if you don't pay your taxes, eventually someone with a gun will show up at your door and take you to jail.
So you call these positive and negative liberties.
Yeah,
I call
we'll
them
get into
positive,
that more.
negative rights.
Yeah.
Same thing.
So, but the idea is there is actually always a sword, no matter what the government structure looks like. There is always a sword eventually.
Yeah.
And so that was Hobbes's point, is that there's always some kind of point of force that is going to be applied. So Hobbes, the phrase Leviathan, I think you're going to hear that phrase more, but we certainly are hearing the phrase strongman quite a bit now.
Yeah.
And I think that
we certainly heard that with Trump in America.
Yeah, and I would argue that
again,
Bush,
not even saying it's a negative term, right? One could argue Biden's a strong man, and they could be positive on that. You could say the same with Trump, be positive or negative, whatever.
I don't think that. I think every American president since FDR has been a strong man.
Oh, yeah.
The government, the United States, just has so much influence worldwide.
Yeah. And World War II certainly ramped that up. Right.
So I'd say every U.S. president since FDR has, or including FDR, has been a strongman to some extent. But I think modern strongmen, Obama's out there dropping drone shots on people. Like as many executive orders as any president ever, and so forth. The accusation that Trump was a strongman is true. But then I would say, and so was
Obama.
Yeah, and so
Bush before him.
So I think Bush certainly was a strongman. Yeah. So the idea though that Hobbes gets to is I think so simple but pretty revolutionary, and that is We live in this state of nature. We don't want to, we're willing to give up some of our freedoms with contracts and agreements, but those contracts and agreements have to be enforced by a strong man, by a Leviathan, by a king. And so then the question isn't like, are we in the age of strong men? It's like, no, we're always headed to the next one.
Yeah.
That's Hobbes's basic contribution. Strong men are not like we tend to think of like sometimes we're going into a phase with a strong man and then sometimes we're not. Hobbes would argue, and I would agree, that we are always headed to the next strong man.
Right.
And these gaps in between are just momentum moves, to the next strong man.
Yeah. So here's what I want to do. I want to actually wrap this particular podcast up and then talk about these 6 distinct qualities of Christ's kingship as the super king. But talking about Hobbes, where would you want Christians? Where would you lead Christians at this point in leading up to that discussion about Christ in particular?
Well, I think that
is it the wanting? Is there more we need to be thinking about in terms of using Hobbes and his political theory as the filter? Where are we headed here?
Well, I think the idea is that Hobbes saw authority as a relief, as a mercy, a blessing. Yes, and we just have to get reoriented to see authority as the common grace that it is.
Yeah,
that is not something that we're prone to do. We're prone to be suspicious of authority. We're prone to take it for granted. We're prone to expect it to be perfect when we ought to just be thankful it exists at all.
Yeah. There's definitely been that flip in our culture.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure when the flip began because we can go back to the 60s and there was definitely an anti-authoritarian culture at that point as well.
And that's Rousseau as well. And I think Rousseau would say that authority is categorically bad.
Right.
And Hobbes would say that authority is categorically good. I think we would say we're not Hobbesian to say that all authority is good.
Right.
Because Hobbes had this idea of de facto authority. It's like if you can be in charge, you deserve to be in charge.
Yeah.
Very brutal, very,
right.
We wouldn't go that far. But we would say that generally speaking, authority has been a common grace upon the world. And in the absence of authority, you would just have chaos and anarchy and so forth.
And so we should desire good authority, albeit flawed. We want good and godly authority even, right?
Right. I mean, just even Paul's command, I want men everywhere lifting up godly hands, holy hands, praying for all the leaders. Well, I can do that in a way if I've got some Hobbesian sensitivities. I can do that in a way that says, God, I'm glad someone's manning this stupid ship, this crazy ship, But I think the other piece of it is that when we realize that we simply lack, as we'll see with Christ here in a minute, we simply lack the leader that we need.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy if Donald Trump has to be my savior, it's especially easy to demonize him.
Right.
If Joe Biden has to be my Jesus,
right,
then it's especially easy to demonize him, and it's especially easy to not take him for granted, and so on and so forth. So, but when I realized that there's actually a king over all these kings, and he's perfect, and he can't get killed like Lincoln, and he can't own slaves like Washington, and so on. He won't blow up his whole administration with a blue dress and an intern.
Right.
Once you start realizing that there's someone actually in charge of all of this, and he is the strong man, I think it puts politics in its proper perspective.
Absolutely.
As well.
So when we look at a person like Trump or Biden, you could complain, but from a Christian perspective, it does leave us longing for this super king.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think more than longing, I think actually believing Daniel 7, 13, 14. He has dominion.
Yeah, he has dominion.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to leave it there for now, and then we're going to get into the next podcast. We're going to pick up the conversation just as a clean break for our listeners. We're about 50 minutes into it. If we continued, I think we'll be at about 2 hours. So thanks everyone for listening. When you're done with this particular podcast, you can, if you haven't been listening for a while, you can check out the other ones we've previously done, and you can look for the part 2 of this particular one in the news feed. I'll actually post a link below so you can continue on with the dialogue there. So Chris, thanks for joining in. Thanks for having the conversation. The response to Rousseau is Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
Not Calvin and Hobbes. Although,
Calvin and Hobbes would be better than Rousseau.
Yeah, Calvin and Hobbes better than Rousseau. So thanks everyone for listening. And then until next time, this is Sean with Cornfield Theology, and this is Chris Oswald, my guest, and peace out. Bye.